The David Bohm Society presents
Many thousands of years ago, our culture was not broken into fragments as it is now. At that time, science and spirituality were not separated. Since then, they have grown far apart. In my view, it is important to bring them together. I'll begin by discussing science. Science is basically an abstract sort of knowledge, systematically and rationally organized, aimed at grasping what is general and what is necessary. Newton's laws provide one of the ideal forms of such knowledge. Science is also a collective activity, and through it, people work together to build up a common body of experimentally tested knowledge over time. Science would not mean much without this activity. However, science has in it certain features, such as wonder and curiosity, which go beyond knowledge. And it has an additional feature that is crucial. Science, when done properly, acknowledges a fact, whether we like it or not. That is, whether it agrees with our deeply held beliefs or not. This openness to acknowledging facts is seldom the case more generally. For example, one would not get very far that way in politics or in most religious organizations. Such an insistence on a certain kind of honesty is the key point of what I call the scientific spirit. This is a principle that infuses scientific activity. Thus, the very way science has developed has implicitly considerable spiritual significance. It would indeed be extraordinary if this spirit could prevail in the whole of life. I think it would remove a considerable part of our problems. This brings us to the question of spirituality. What is spirit? The word is derived from a Latin word meaning breath or wind, like respiration or inspiration. It is suggested by the trees moving with the invisible force of the wind. We may thus think of spirit as an invisible force, a life-giving essence that moves us deeply, or as a source that moves everything from within. Spirit is therefore not manifest. The word manifest means literally in Latin what could be held in the hand. You cannot hold spirit in the hand. It is subtle, which is really the opposite of manifest. According to the dictionary, the word subtle means highly refined, delicate, elusive, indefinable. The Latin root of the word is in fact subtextless, meaning finely woven. We could picture finer and finer nets to grasp reality. But ultimately, spirit is so subtle that it passes through all of them. Although unseen and ungraspable, it is of key importance. One important point that we connect with spirit is meaning. According to the dictionary, the word meaning has three definitions: significance, value, and purpose. See, if I say it means a lot to me, it's the same as high value, and I say I mean to do it is the same as to say that's my purpose. Now, significance is, of course, simply like a sign that points to something. Value has the same root as valor and valiant. It means strong. We sense the value of something by being strongly moved. We could further say that if something is very significant, we sense its value, and that generates a strong purpose. These are three key features of life, and life would have little value if it lacked meaning, for then it would lack significance and we would generate little energy or purpose. Therefore, spirit, although its meaning may be very subtle or ungraspable, seems to have a tremendous effect. We could indeed say that without significance, value, and purpose, life would have little point. A sense of pointlessness or meaninglessness in our society may be at the root of much of the current malaise. I would add further that meaning is at the root of the whole of our being. How we act is determined by what everything means to us. A very elementary case is a person walking in a dark place who sees a shadow which suggests that an assailant may be present. This interpretation of the shadow can arouse the whole body, the adrenaline, the heart, everything else. The meaning of the shadow made these changes occur. And if we, again, see its meaning as just a shadow, all that will vanish. Meanings of much greater subtlety may move us much more. If we're going to face difficult questions and problems, we have to see their meaning and have the energy to do it. But as we've seen, the ultimate source of meaning is subtle and cannot be made manifest. Deeper meanings lead us toward the question of spirituality. The human being has a natural orientation to spirituality. Indeed, our ancestors saw spirit in everything, and as the ultimate source of everything. Everything was for them alive, and each individual was a part of it all. That was a rather natural view. Gradually, as civilization developed, people moved away from direct contact with nature into farms. Yes? I was a bit too fast, yeah. Yes. Yes. Louder, yes. Yes. Louder. Right. Try the other mic. There's no other mic. As civilization developed, people moved away from direct contact with nature into farms and cities. Organized religions developed as spiritual activity and replaced nature as the key contact with spirit, as well as connecting spiritual needs with the needs of society. Religions generally included a certain kind of philosophy, an overall worldview that was compatible with the basic notions of that particular religion about spirituality. Later, however, as technology and science developed, they split off from religion. A different worldview developed that became more and more independent of religion. In more modern times, this scientific view began to prevail. Thus, in ancient Greece, there was a view that the universe was ordered from the center of the earth, and that spirit became more important as we went out toward heaven with its order of increasing perfection. Everything was highly imperfect on the earth while the planets moved in eternal perfect orbits. It was said that an object would fall because the natural place for it was to be at the center of the earth, and it was striving to reach that place. Everything had its place and moved according to its place. This idea was carried further in the Middle Ages. It produced a worldview in complete harmony with the prevailing religion. In modern times, this harmony has broken up. The modern view has been that of mechanism. The universe was compared to a gigantic machine, originally a clockwork and later a structure of atoms. This outlook has gone on to regard the human being as a machine and is linked to the development of artificial intelligence. Thus, Descartes said that everything was a machine, all animals, the human body, and so on. Only the immortal soul of the human being was not a machine. This perception led to a division of labor between religion and science. Science thereby gained freedom from interference by religion. God created the world, this machine, and let it run. Scientists could study the cosmic machine while theologians could deal with the immortal soul of the human being. The scientists could thus feel that the machine was their business. Clearly, this suited their purposes. Theologians were happy too, because they wanted to fight pantheism, which said that there was spirit in nature. They didn't like that idea for many reasons. Therefore, they were very ready to accept this notion, which is just what they needed for their purpose. But then they lost in the long run because science began to probe into what appeared to be the ultimate, into the edges of the universe, into life, into the body, into intelligence, and nowhere did it see this immortal soul. It looked as if we could explain everything as a machine. This development has led to a view that has had bad effects. For example, Steven Weinberg, one of the leading physicists of our time, has said that the more we look into the cosmos, the less we see any evidence of meaning. There is no place in this for spirit. It is all mechanism. The domain of the spirit has receded until it's gone as far as science is concerned. We may still hold on to the idea of spirit in spite of this, but at the expense of a kind of split in life. For example, when I was at college, there was a biology professor who taught evolution. He had more or less fundamentalist views on religion. So when they asked him how he could do this, he said, well, on weekdays I teach evolution, and on Sundays I have an entirely different view. Similarly, when we work in society, we are actually mechanists. Almost everything that is now being done in society is mechanical or mechanistically oriented. but we may try to bring spirituality into other areas on special occasions. This demonstrates a lack of coherence. Are we having trouble?
Yeah.
Will we do better here?
Yeah.
This demonstrates a lack of coherence. Incoherence means it doesn't hold together. We are working against ourselves, wasting energy and being counterproductive. To have a real meaning, in any case, requires coherence. Incoherent meanings eventually have no meaning. That is probably the root of meaninglessness. There are so many meanings around that do not cohere and do not add up to a whole meaning. Modern views on science must be contributing to the current lack of meaning. First of all, directly by being mechanistic, and secondly, indirectly, by leading people who want to hold on to spirituality to be incoherent in various aspects of their lives. But does modern science really force us into mechanism? At present, most scientists seem to believe that this is inevitable. A reasonable argument could perhaps have been made for this in the 19th century, but since then, there has been relativity and quantum theory, which were fundamental revolutions. I want to suggest that relativity and quantum theory are more compatible with the non-mechanistic view than with the mechanistic one. In particular, the mathematics of the quantum theory suggests that the basic movement of matter is to be understood as a kind of unfoldment and enfoldment. The mathematics suggests, for example, a set of waves that unfold from the whole of space into each region and enfold back again into the whole. Or to put it differently, from a subtle enfoldment in the whole, there arises by a process of unfoldment the entire manifest universe with its many different and separated objects. This sort of movement I have called the implicate order, in which the existence of each part of the world is constantly sustained by unfoldment from the whole and enfoldment back into the whole. The hologram is an instrument that illustrates this principle. The key point is then that modern physics implies that in some way, and to some degree, everything is internally related to the whole and therefore to everything else. Another example of internal relationship is to be found in consciousness. For in consciousness, we take in everything, it is all in us, and the total content of consciousness determines what we are and how we will respond. We are therefore related internally to the whole and thus to everything else, rather than externally and mechanically. For example, if people want to change the course of action of others, the appropriate way is not to push and pull mechanically, that would be violence, but rather it is to say something and thus to transmit meaning. If such communication succeeds, the listener takes in the meaning of what is said and acts accordingly. It follows from this that something like the implicate order is common both to consciousness and to matter in general. The implicate order may therefore provide a basis for the relationship of the two. Thus, we can see, for example, that the content of consciousness can in principle enfold the entire material universe, if you're looking out at the sky at night, for example. But insofar as consciousness gives rise to physical action, including communication with others, its content is enfolded in matter and in the consciousness of others. Therefore, not only is all matter internally related, but so is matter and consciousness, and through this, all consciousness is also internally related. Of course, this does not deny the relative independence of objects, as given in classical physics, and the relative independence of consciousness of different people. But more generally, not only do ourselves and our minds not have complete externality relationship implied by a mechanism, but even physical objects are not completely mechanical when looked at deeply, for example, from electronic level. However, the non-mechanical whole, including the world and ourselves, will produce parts that behave in a limited area approximately like a machine. But science can now be understood as showing limits to mechanism, which ultimately allow something more subtle, such as spirituality, to play a key role. Nevertheless, science as we know it cannot by itself give meaning in the deep sense of ultimate significance, value, and purpose. Science, of course, does have values in it. To acknowledge the fact whether you like it or not is an important value. Also, science has the purpose of obtaining knowledge and satisfying curiosity. However, this is still a rather limited meaning. Science can interfere with a coherent, broader meaning if it is taken in a strictly mechanistic sense. Organized religions can also do this by forcefully imposing beliefs with their implied values and purposes in a mechanical way. Ultimately, such views lead to repetitive mechanical meanings in a way that is not basically different from that which results from the mechanistic point of view in science. An inquiry into spirituality, therefore, has to be done in a scientific spirit of acknowledging any fact. Whether we like it or not, we're at least looking at it and not simply rejecting it or refusing to look, as many do. But can we really do this? Or will we be too attached to the sense of security that comes from firmly held beliefs? I happen to know the Dalai Lama and have had many talks with him. I remember once someone asked him, suppose science should show that one of the beliefs of Buddhism was not right. He said, then we would surely drop it if it is clearly shown. This demonstrates that it is possible to have some sort of religious view and not to take your beliefs so firmly that nothing could ever be questioned. Alternatively, could there be more of a spiritual part in science also? A current notion that is commonly accepted is that science is value-free, except possibly for truth and honesty and similar notions. But that is not really so. Thus, Thomas Kuhn has said that scientists almost unconsciously pick up paradigms in their apprenticeships, which have all sorts of values in them. One of the current values is that mechanism is the right way and the only way. Another value is that we want to make everything calculable by some sort of algorithm. It would be good for scientists to be aware of their values and to examine them in a truly scientific manner, as we let the scientific spirit extend to allow for the examination of the values of science, or at least for the frank acknowledgement that they are there and that many of them have no necessary basis. In such an approach, scientists can detect incoherences in their basic values, and this may lead them to want to change some of them. The importance of values is thus clear. Values have significance behind them. Wholeness is one significance, and mechanism is another. If the universe signifies mechanism and the values implicit therein, then individuals must fend for themselves. With mechanism, individuals are separate and have to take care of themselves first. We are all pushing against each other and everyone is trying to win. The significance of wholeness, however, is that everything is related internally to everything else, and therefore, in the long run, it has no meaning for people to ignore the needs of others. Similarly, if we regard the world as made up of a lot of little externally related bits, we will try to exploit each bit and we will end up by destroying the planet. At present, we do not adequately realize that we are one whole with the planet, that our whole being and substance comes out of it. A key part of the general significance is our overall worldview, and such worldviews have profound effects on values. Therefore, what we say or assume about these things is not to be taken lightly. An inquiry of this kind clearly has a broader significance for the whole of our culture. Too fast. To see what this means, I would first point out that culture, in my view, is shared meaning. Whatever form of culture we see is the sharing of meaning, whether this be in science, in art, or in spirituality. Now, what is art? Going back to the derivation of words, the word art is based on a Latin root meaning to fit. It appears in English in words like artifact, articulate, article, and artisan. All this suggests that in earlier times, art was not regarded as being separate from life as a whole. But with the general tendency of civilization to fragmentation, we have broken things up and have said that art is a special activity. It has very little practical significance and is primarily aesthetic in its value. However, as far as art is concerned, I would emphasize that fitting means coherence. In its own way, art is generally concerned with making coherent wholes. Many people are looking for holism, but not all holistic views are coherent. For example, Nazism aimed at a kind of totalitarian approach, which means whole, but it was highly incoherent and it certainly did not bring about good results. It's clear that we're looking for coherent wholeness, not just any wholeness. The artist, like the scientist, is looking to create a coherent whole, But he or she differs from the scientist in that he or she is not looking for a general knowledge of what is necessary, nor is the artist, as a rule, building a collective structure of art. Rather, artists generally want to create individual works, not necessarily absolutely so. A given work of art may have a universal significance, but it has to be in a concretely perceptible form, experienced in an actual moment or succession of moments. It is not treated by rules or universal laws, so it is not like a scientific theory, whose very essence is the aim for universality and necessity. Necessity is perceived in each work of art. Art has its own internal necessity that is not mainly an abstract general structure of ideas that an artist might build up over a period of time. The individual work of art, therefore, could stand by itself, whereas scientific theories have to be seen as parts of an overall body of scientific knowledge. It seems to be commonly agreed upon that art may have a deep spiritual significance, not only in its content, but in the creativity that produces it. We therefore speak of artistic spirit and ask whether life as a whole could be infused with this artistic spirit as well as with the scientific. That is to say, in our actions from moment to moment, we would have a perceptive attitude, not mechanical, not repetitious or routine, in which we would be moving toward making everything fit to cohere. Even science should properly be done with this artistic spirit in its actual doing, rather than by following rules and formulae. I do not think that a science of science would be right, nor would it get very far. I think it would be best to call it the art of science. Without the scientific spirit and the artistic spirit, we cannot have an overall coherent spirituality. To have incoherent spirituality is not going to be helpful. It could be said that science, art, and spirituality are the principal content of culture. There is not a great deal of culture that would not be somehow included in these if we broaden the meaning of these terms the way I would like to do. As long as these elements are separate, we cannot have an overall coherent culture. Since culture is shared meaning, we then cannot have a coherent shared meaning. That is to say, our culture ultimately will have little or no meaning. Without meaning, our society will fall apart. It will have no value, no purpose. We can see evidence that society is falling apart throughout the world. Not only that, but the individual cannot be healthy or whole in a culture that is split at its foundations. If individuals lack coherence, significance, value, and purpose, they will suffer not only mentally but also physically. In this regard, social incoherence and individual incoherence feed on each other. Individuals living in an incoherent society tend to become inwardly incoherent, and then in turn they help to make up an incoherent society. The world is now facing a series of crises, political, social, economic, ecological, and spiritual, which threatens the very existence of our civilization and perhaps of the species as well. On the one hand, science has opened up enormous possibilities for a creative and happy life for all of humanity. On the other hand, it has become evident that because of the general incoherence of society and the individual that I've just described, the further progress of science along its current lines cannot resolve these crises and may indeed tend to aggravate them. Thus, for example, it seems clear that science cannot make it possible for us to act together with the coherence and general goodwill needed to provide everyone with an adequate physical and social basis for life, and at the same time to avoid destroying the planet through ecological disasters, climate changes, and so on. Nor can it help us deal with the forces of nationalism and religious divisions, so that these will no longer prevent us from getting together to meet all these problems, which are evidently of a worldwide nature. Clearly, this sort of thing will be possible only if there is a widespread sharing of meaning, allowing for the creation of a coherent culture which would eventually be planetary. How can a coherent culture come about? I want to suggest that the essential start is to be able to have a dialogue. In this way, people in different subcultures can come together to dialogue, to share their meanings, perhaps to emerge with new meanings that would be common. We have to begin with people who are open enough to start the dialogue. We cannot begin with those who don't want to. We need a place where people could get together merely to talk without trying to solve any problems, simply to communicate, to share, and see if they can come to a common understanding. There is no set form or practice to establish communication except to engage in communicating itself and then encounter the problems of trying to do that. Also, if we say that we want to communicate, but we give first priority to solving a certain practical problem, this will limit us. Behind every practical problem, there are assumptions that may stop us. Some of the things that we want to communicate may not be compatible with these assumptions. Let us therefore say that we want to communicate and we're not going to give first priority to solving any problem. This reminds me of a story I read many years ago. An anthropologist was studying a North American Indian tribe. He observed that they got together in a circle frequently, 20 to 30 people, I suppose, and they would talk. There was no agenda, no decision-making, no authority. They would stop talking at a certain point, and the anthropologist did not understand the stopping point. However, when they stopped, they all seemed to know what action to take because they understood each other so well. We cannot do this now. There are probably too many people, but our meetings are much more difficult when we try to get people to really work together. Imagine people all getting together even in one country. We cannot do it even in one family, much less between countries, cultures, religions, because we are unconsciously committed from the very outset to doing the opposite. This is the point. It is not an accident that we find this so hard. We try to overcome this commitment, but this means that we are unconsciously resisting the very thing we are trying to do. This resistance is in our memory and in the whole system, including our whole culture. And it is not coherent, it is counterproductive to try to do something and hold back at the same time. I think we have to transform the culture by starting with the nucleus, a small group of people that might make a new culture, or might start to make one anyway. As I said, to do this is not really a practice, but a constant situation of learning creatively in communication. As we begin to share meaning, we will also share values and develop a common purpose. If everyone understands the same thing, we could all work together. If we all see it differently and have different ends, we cannot do it. The real trouble is, as I've already said, that we do not have a coherent culture. Anthropological studies suggest that in earlier times, people generally had a more coherent culture. It is essential that we create a coherent culture now. Otherwise, I do not think that the human race is viable, at least if we try to go beyond the level of the Stone Age. With the arrival of modern technology, we have to take steps. We have to take this step or we can't go on. Modern technology is increasing our power by leaps and bounds, power to destroy as well as to create. For example, with the iron axe, we were able to cut down trees at a great rate in Roman times and make deserts out of most of northern Africa. And now with the chainsaw, we could cut down everything within a short time if we wanted to. The point is we must get together to do something intelligent about this. And if people cannot talk together, how can we do it? We have to begin with those who understand the point and see its necessity. And they are the nucleus. We could call this the microcosm of a larger coherent culture. If we could establish such a microculture, this might spread. However, we cannot establish this through an agenda with a definite end in view, because this will already be a distortion that will lead to distortion by the unconscious motives that bring about resistance. For example, the people who thought of establishing socialism made an attempt to confront this problem, but all the unconscious motives of self-centeredness resisted and it never really worked. I think people will sooner or later discover that capitalism does not work either. Just look at our ecological problems. We must really do something different. If we could establish free communication in which all these unconscious motives could be explored, all this might change. What we need to be able to do is to talk, to communicate. And the UN are not discussing the basic issues at all because they are really not negotiable. They are negotiating the small points that people are ready to trade off, but we cannot come to a common policy that way. What is needed is dialogue in the basic sense of this word, which implies that meaning is flowing through and amongst people rather than an exchange where each person tries to win by making his or her view prevail.
Dialogue, therefore, means creating something new where everybody wins. The basic idea of dialogue is to be able to talk while suspending personal opinions, as it were, holding them out in front of you and the group for all to see their coherence or incoherence, while neither suppressing them, nor insisting on them, nor trying to convince or persuade others of their value. Instead, we just want to understand. In a way, this is comparable to allowing the scientific spirit to infuse our communication. We need to have a kind of scientific attitude when we talk. It does not mean that we're doing laboratory experiments, but for the most part, we are listening to the opinions of all, whether they are pleasing or outrageous. That is the essence of the scientific spirit. We're just listening if we can do it. In this art of dialogue, the first priority is to see the whole meaning of everyone without having to make any decision as to who is right and who is wrong. It is more important to see the whole meaning than that any particular opinion should prevail, because seeing this will create a new frame of mind in which consciousness of all has a common content, the content being all these opinions at which we are all looking. The other person's opinion is looked at the same as mine is. It means a common consciousness that is coherent. It is a kind of implicate order where each unfolds into the whole consciousness and the whole into each. With this common coherent consciousness, we have a new kind of intelligence capable of thinking together. Usually people in a group do not think together. Each one has his or her own idea and tries to get it across, even though he or she might sometimes accept a part of someone else's opinion. In thinking together, however, one person will have an idea and it may pass to the next person who will pick it up as though it was their own, and it will go on like that, just almost like one person thinking. The idea does not belong to anybody. This requires complete trust, which develops only if we are able to get through all the obstacles to dialogue, these unconscious motives of self-centeredness that I have mentioned. I do not want to give the impression that this will be straightforward or easy, but I think if people see the necessity and are serious about it, we could do something. We can have this common consciousness, this intelligence. This fellowship is, we have a common bond of impersonal fellowship or participation. This fellowship is one of the more powerful feelings that there is. I read recently that many people used to find something good in war because they experienced a valuable comradeship that they could never get in civilian life. They were ready to go through all the horrors of war to gain this, but we do not need a war to have fellowship or comradeship. That is one discovery that we must make. With this common consciousness, people could create a coherent culture which implies a coherent mind and body for each individual as well. What underlies such consciousness is this infinitely subtle spirit which cannot be defined, out of which emerges the ultimate meanings in ways which we cannot see or grasp. This infuses the whole with a coherent but dynamic and creative meaning. This spirit is in some sense one, undivided. It is so subtle that we could say little about it, but it is essential to consider the possibility that it is there. If we try to say that it is not there, we will go over to mechanism in the end. We will then be left only with material values which cannot move us to the creation of a coherent and meaningful society with a coherent approach to nature. The subtle but dynamic spirit that I have suggested unfolds into many aspects, including the scientific, artistic, and religious, and would bring about a different way of living, both individually and together, which would move toward an unbroken whole. It would allow creative freedom to the individual that is not imposed, but would arise naturally. People would see the necessity of it and see that it is so much better than the other way. Since wholeness, health, and holiness are the same root, and since sanity has basically a similar meaning, it would imply the health of the body, mind, and society, and of course the spirit beyond.
continue?
I'm all right. I'll try to take some questions. All right. Thank you. What? Yes. Yes, there seems to be some time left, so perhaps I would take some questions. I'll move over and sit down.
Here.
Yeah, all right.
My understanding, which is certainly limited, of your idea is that there is only fundamentally one whole. And yet, as I listen to your remarks, you're talking about a shift which could bring us into a more coherent whole, and in some way it sounds like a different whole or wholeness. So I would be interested in hearing your idea of what this coherent culture might look like or feel like, and how that is different or a different whole than the one that is already fundamental.
Yes, well, we may have many ideas about the whole. The simplest idea is a static whole that is complete, which is not what I am proposing, but rather a whole which is really a movement toward wholeness, rather than a complete whole. Right? And it means also that we will always find that from time to time our thoughts or our actions are not coherent, which means they're not producing the results we intend, producing results we don't want and don't expect, and so on. And therefore, if we will acknowledge this fact rather than cover it up, as so often the case, then we will begin to change our ideas and move toward greater coherence. So I say this whole, bringing coherence requires that the whole be all brought together. If we have a lot of different parts which have no relation, then it's very hard to imagine coherence. Now, I would take it that we would have a society not in which everything would always be coherent, because we would always be discovering incoherence as we extend our experience and our knowledge, but we would always be open to acknowledging this fact and to move toward coherence, to have new ideas that move toward coherence. Now, this is something which is not common in our present society. An attempt is made to do this in science, although highly imperfectly. In other areas, it is rather rare to say that we are going to acknowledge incoherence when we see it, or even welcome the perception of it, so that we will be able to learn to move toward greater coherence. See, it's a different attitude. The wholeness is the movement toward wholeness and not a static whole. And the movement toward coherence and not a final coherence. Now, in general, our thought process at least over the past 5,000 years or so, if not more, has been that when we see incoherence, we tend to blot out awareness of it. We tend to try to make ourselves more comfortable. You see, I think in social psychology they have a term which is very useful called cognitive dissonance. If we have two cognitions that are dissonant, they make us uncomfortable. We may say we have one idea about ourselves, but another fact which shows that idea is not right. We like the idea about ourselves or our country or whatever it is, our religion. And what happens is that the consciousness of this dissonance is blotted out. And this way we remove dissonance by blotting out awareness of it rather than by finding the source of it and producing genuine coherence and genuine consonance. But see, this has been a major feature of our thought process. Propaganda is an extreme case of it. The purpose of propaganda is exactly to do this, to blot out evidence of incoherence. And we have to see that this is really very silly. It's pointless and silly and destructive. And if we follow this with the present development of technology, we can't get away with it any longer. It will eventually destroy us. See, at the level of the Stone Age, we are not destructive enough to do very much, so we can think that way to some extent. But now we no longer can get away with it. We have to have this scientific spirit of acknowledging incoherence wherever we see it and being ready to change our ideas to make it more coherent.
Dr. Bohm, could you speak more explicitly about the relationship between the implicate order, the explicate order, and consciousness?
Yes. Yes, well, I've introduced the implicate order first in connection with physics, of having something unfolded, which unfolds into the manifest world as a way of explaining the manifest world, which is different from the mechanistic way of saying it's made of certain parts which are externally related, and they're just put together, the parts, and make up. The whole is nothing but our way of looking at how a large bunch of parts are put together. Whereas in this way we have a whole which is internally related, which is intrinsically one, because each part contains the whole enfolded. And its activity depends on the way it enfolds the whole. Now, it's not merely passive enfoldment. Now, I say consciousness is similar. See, if you look, we unfold this whole room into our consciousness, or in the whole world outside, or the sky, looking at the sky at night, the whole universe. And according to the meaning of what is enfolded, our whole response follows, not merely outward action, but also the inward state of mind and body and feeling. It all comes from this whole which is enfolded. I mean, some change in what is enfolded will change the entire psyche, the entire body, everything. I gave the example, a trivial example of imagining that a shadow is an assailant and the whole body is mobilized, the whole mind. And seeing that it's a shadow, it all goes. Now, if we unfold the notion that the world has no meaning, then this will affect everything, the whole way body works and the whole way the mind works. It will, in a way, lower everything. It will depress everything. And so I say that there's this great similarity between this enfoldment which goes on in, which one can see in quantum theory, and the enfoldment which one can see in the experience of consciousness. And this similarity might provide the basis for a relationship. Or at least there's enough similarity so that possibly a coherent relationship could be established. Now, if we don't establish that relationship, then we can either say the mind is nothing but part of the machine, which is the way modern science is moving. It's called an epiphenomenon, which has no particular causal efficacy, but just simply as a sort of a way of talking about things. Or you could take the view of dualism, saying mind and matter are entirely different, and then you have to understand how they could be related. Or you could take the view of idealism, which says that it's all mind, and that matter is nothing but a thought, for example, in the mind of God. Now, these are various possibilities. Now, what I'm proposing is to say, I'm not giving a final explanation of mind and matter, but I'm saying that if the implicate order provides a way of thinking which enables one to see how they can be related. I mean, it would still leave open the question of what is their deeper nature.
I would like the methodological question. How the scientist, in your concrete work, can or may perform to the transfer to the spirituality. Is it possible, write the question in Czech? Is it possible to translate my question?
I'd have somebody translate it.
Didn't... Yeah, it's possible? Yeah. Já bych chtěla položit otázku z oblasti metodologie, sice jak vědec
She would like to pose a question from the realm of methodology.
Mám to opakovat? Jo? Chtěla bych položit otázku metodologickou, a sice jak konkrétní vědec ve své konkrétní práci v různých oblastech, v různých vědních oborech může nebo jak by měl přistupovat ke své konkrétní práci tak, aby se mu dařilo přesáhnout směrem k té spiritualitě.
The question was, how can specific scientists in their concrete everyday work, they represent different disciplines, how can they extend their scientific work so they're moving in the direction of spirituality, they're bridging the gap?
Yeah. Well, yes, how do we bridge the gap? Well, I think to some extent the scientists are moving toward the unity of science. Many scientists are trying to establish unity among different sciences. This may be done on a mechanistic basis. This is the most common way it's being done now. But see, if we could try to bring about the unity on a less mechanistic basis, this would move toward bridging the gap. You see, I think the gap now is that most of our culture is, at least in the scientific technical side, is mechanistic. And we're living a mechanistic life. You see, if you went back to the earlier times of the hunter-gatherer societies, or like the North American Indians, then they really see the universe as spirit. In other words, in daily life, they see nature as, they see the trees and the animals as spirit. They are not saying that this is just a myth, a nice mythology, but rather that is their mode of experiencing and perceiving the world. Now, so that there's no conflict between spirituality and their mode of perceiving the world. But we have a conflict because science and technology have developed basically in a mechanistic way, and therefore we will see a difference when we carry out our everyday life and some of our ideas. Now, I think we have to move toward coherence, so we can't establish coherence right away, totally. And one move toward coherence is to establish a unity of science on a non-mechanistic basis. I've tried to say that psychology and physics might have a certain unity through the implicate order. So that would be a move in that direction. Now, eventually, this coherence would only come about if we actually were not to see these objects as a machine, as mechanistic. You see, we are seeing everything as a machine, and to a certain extent it is a machine, as a certain approximation. But if we were actually seeing the world as infused with spirit, rather than sort of just talking about it that way, while we use mechanism in our daily life. Now, I think that that as a scientist, that would be the principal thing he could do. The other side of the thing he could do would be to try to engage in dialogue, to establish a dialogue in science, to establish a greater coherence among human beings. And this is not easy because science ought to be open to dialogue, but in fact it isn't very open to dialogue as it has developed now. It tends to contain a belief in the final truth of what science is aiming at, which is incompatible, incoherent. So the movement toward dialogue would be what anybody might do toward establishing, sort of bringing greater spirituality into life.
We're talking.
Well, not the best value of the recent history, the most coherent society were science, communism, and people pure.
Yes, you're saying, you're questioning whether coherence is a good way of judging society, considering that Hitler's Germany and communism were coherent. But I don't think they were coherent. You see, I think they were extremely incoherent. The violence of these societies showed extreme incoherence. And that must have been tremendous conflict within there. And I think that their aim was a certain kind of coherence, but since they did not realize that aim, they were incoherent, because the fundamental meaning of incoherence is that you do not produce the result you intend.
Dr. Bohm?
Right.
From all of us, I want to thank you for the dedication and sincerity that you have brought to your work, and the inspiration that it's provided to all of us.
dbohm.com